Well, good afternoon. Welcome. I really appreciate that folks have come out today on this really important topic for the Middleton Center. Now, I'm David Mitchell. I'm one of the co-directors. I'd also like to sort of talk about some of the changes that we had at the center and then introduce the panel and our topic. So the topic for today is part of our conversations at the Crossroads, which is when we talk about contemporary issues, getting scholarly impact that deals with interdisciplinary perspectives on issues of the moment. And so this is one of the conversations, and it's an issue that is been in the press, but of course is now, I think, receded to the background with the war in Ukraine, with the hurricane in Florida. It's not getting the same degree of attention that it once did back in August. And I think sort of making sure that it doesn't lose, if you will, prominence. Community impact of infrastructure neglect and disinvestment, the Jackson, Mississippi water crisis. One of the changes to the center I'd like to sort of introduce, of course, is our new associate director to the center, Dr. Sharupa Prasad, who's associate professor in the Department of Women and Gender Studies and the director of South Asian Studies. Excuse me. Her research interests include interdisciplinary perspectives on disease, medicine and health, colonialism, race and gender, globalization in India, feminist theory and methods, food studies, affect theory and theories of the body. And more broadly, her research and teaching span the histories of racism, gender, colonialism, and nationalism, in particular, their cross-national entanglements. I am looking forward to having Sharupa as a partner, helping the center grow and continue to evolve. So, Sharupa, welcome. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Sure. For today's panelists, our three panelists, not in the order of which they're presenting, but in the order in which they appear on the slide. So Dr. Kaleea Lewis is an assistant professor in the Department of Public Health and Women's and Gender Studies. She received her Master's of Science and Doctor of Philosophy in Public Health with a concentration in health promotion, education, and behavior from the Arnold School of Public Health at the University of South Carolina. As a scholar trained in the social and health sciences, Dr. Lewis draws extensively from critical race theory, sociological theories of race and racism, and social determinants of health framework. Her research broadly explores how systems of power and oppression emerge in the lived experiences of emerging Black adults and impact their mental health and mental health seeking behaviors. The overarching goal of her interdisciplinary and racial health equity focused research is to create interventions that reduce racial mental health disparities and increase mental health service utilization. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Dr. Rebecca Scott, Associate Professor and Director of Undergraduate Studies. She received her PhD from the University of California, Santa Cruz. Her areas of study are environmental inequality, settler culture, gender, race and class, nature, place and embodiment, material culture, critical masculinity and whiteness studies, property, fossil fuels, mining, fracking, regionalization, racialization, and national identity. Basically, she's teaching the entire social curriculum. Her research and teaching her cultural studies, environmental justice, gender, race, and class, and she teaches courses in social theory, gender, race, and class, and cultural studies, and environmental sociology. She's currently working on a book centered on fracking and the pipeline boom with a focus on property as a technology of personhood and exploitation. Thank you, Dr. Scott. Appreciate it. Dr. David Switzler, Assistant Professor in the Truman School of Government and Public Affairs. He received his PhD from Texas A&M University. His research emphasis is on environmental policy, public management, local government. His work stands at the intersection of political science, public management, and normative theory, with an emphasis on water policy in the United States. His major research focus is on how political and administrative variables shape the implementation and development of environmental policy at the local level. And his current research agenda is aimed at exploring how the organizational structure of water utilities determines responses to the political, climatological, and demographic environment in which the organization exists. He has additional interest in democratic theory, urban policy, and environmental justice. Thank you, Dr. Switzler, for being present. The Jackson, Mississippi water crisis. To set the stage for our speakers, the city's drinking water treatment system had problems for years before the crisis. In 2010, a winter storm caused several water main breaks and a widespread outage. In 2012, Jackson failed a U.S. Environmental Protection Agency inspection enforcing Safe Drinking Water Act, resulting in a November 2012 settlement, and several efforts by city officials in the aftermath of the 2010 storm to secure money for improvements by bond issues and local option sales were blocked. From 2017 to 2021, Jackson recorded an annual average of 55 breaks per 100 miles of water line, higher than the safe rate of 15 breaks or less. In July 2022, damage inflicted at the Curtis treatment plant forced the water utility to switch to backup pumps. As a result, Jackson issued a boil water advisory on July 28th. The order was still in effect when the August 2022 flooding arrived. This resulted in approximately 150,000 residents in the city being left without access to safe drinking water. United States President Joe Biden declared a federal disaster to trigger federal aid. On September 4th, officials announced that they had restored water pressure most of the day, and the governor said that the conditions of the plant should pump out much cleaner water, and for long-term solutions, they needed more money. What we have found here, what has been at least been addressed, is that there has been issues around politics, issues around racial disinvestment, lack of community infrastructure disinvestment, and neglect, and dealing with issues of redlining, white flight, and warring or conflicting political parties addressing the issues of how to deal with a crisis. Of course, I'm not the expert on these particular issues. I'm going to leave it to the three who are here to offer their comments. And so once again, I thank you very much, those who are here and in our Zoom space, and our experts for their comments. Thank you.
Yeah, I might as well start because I have some comments about environmental justice and the environmental justice movement and the way that some of the circumstances have seemed to be in a process of transformation, or at least new things are happening that I just want to comment on based on the situation in Jackson and put that into a context, a kind of historical context. So when we talk about environmental justice, we're talking about a reorienting of the environmental movement in the late 20th century from concerns that were mostly of privileged people like wilderness conservation to the concerns of those who were forced to bear most of the costs of industrialization without sharing the benefits. And so the term environmental racism captures the intersections of structural racism, structural violence, as well as the symbolic violence that makes these cases normalized and naturalized. So when we talk about the environmental justice movement, it started in the late 20th century. And I just want to mention three landmark cases of environmental racism, drawing on the work of Dorcetta Taylor, who is an environmental sociologist at the University of Michigan. And these are the ones that she mentions in her book, Toxic Communities, which are the sort of the founding of the movement of environmental justice. So the first one was Triana, Alabama, where a chemical factory had been manufacturing DDT and polluting nearby waterways in a majority Black community for 30 years before residents found out in the late 70s and started to try to protect themselves and get justice. There's another case that's famous in Warren County, North Carolina, where a chemical waste landfill, PCBs, was placed in a majority Black and low-income county, one of the poorest counties in North Carolina, in the late 70s. And the site didn't even meet the EPA's own guidelines, but it was argued to be the best option, despite having a high water table and a lot of other things. So this led to protests from the community and inspired the United Church of Christ's report on toxic waste and race in the US, which established the framework of environmental racism and established that there was a pattern of disproportionate siting of toxic facilities in Black and poor communities. And then her final case was the St. James Parish in Louisiana, which is known as Cancer Alley because of the synergistic effects of multiple petrochemical facilities and toxic waste disposal sites in the area that include lots of oil refineries, cracker plants, making plastic, and petrochemical plants of all kinds. So if you notice, all of these facilities, all of these examples are focused on the effects of toxic waste, producing industries, or toxic waste storage and dumping. They're what is known as locally unwanted land uses. And these cases involve both structural and symbolic violence. For instance, they often involve job blackmail, where in case of economic disinvestment, a community doesn't have any economic resources and toxic industries are able to pass themselves off as beneficial for the community because they offer jobs. And so the people are like, well, we'd like to have a clean environment, but we also need wages. So this is job blackmail. And this is also, despite the fact that a lot of times the number of people from the local community is actually rather low that end up working in places like that. And they also involve the creation of sacrifice zones which are geographic areas and communities that are socially constructed as being useless or devalued in the public imagination. And so they are therefore suitable for sacrifice for the greater good. And so obviously environmental racism is reliant on residential segregation, and it often relies on a pattern of not sharing information on risks, like the Triana, Alabama case. They didn't share information on risks with the communities, or they don't share concerns about exposures. And it's all subject to a process of market sorting, where locally unwanted land uses impact property values. And because of the correlation between race and income in the US, this leads to an effect, which is the disproportional effect of these industries on communities of color. And it also involves things like the corporations and regulators taking the path of least resistance, where low-income neighborhoods and neighborhoods with a lot of turnover and residents have less financial and social capital to fight plans to locate toxic industries in their communities. And it's also supported by laws and legal structures like the Interstate Commerce Clause, which prevent local communities from putting limits on the kinds of things that can be imported into their areas. These kinds of things like banning toxic dumping or something like that is interpreted as unfairly burdening corporations and impeding interstate commerce. So in this kind of frame of environmental racism, there is a clear pattern of discriminatory impacts that's been kind of known since the United Church of Christ Toxic Waste and Race Report in 1987. But there is a problem with prosecuting these cases because the law requires a smoking gun of discriminatory impact, and it's usually said to be market forces, which are neutral, that cause this pattern. So there's no smoking gun of discriminatory impact on the part of regulators and industry. Okay, so that's kind of like what I would call the classic cases of environmental racism. And what we've seen today, the things that we're talking about today, are seem to have different causes. They're less directly shaped by industrial processes or discriminatory siting practices than by post-industrial neoliberal politics of disinvestment. They don't reflect industrial waste or toxins in and of themselves, although those things are present. But they reflect a disinvestment in the basics of modern life and hygiene, especially clean water. So I just want to talk a little bit about Flint and put that in comparison with the case in Jackson. The Flint water crisis of 2014 is still not resolved. It's still ongoing because a lot of people have distrust in the government and the water system, and they're still dependent on bottled water. But this Flint crisis has its roots in both structural and symbolic violence. The city used to be a company town for General Motors, but its population dropped and transformed after most of the factories closed. In the height of the 70s, there were about 80,000 people working for General Motors. Now there's about 5,000, and that's in one factory that's still open. So Flint was one of the majority Black cities in Michigan that had gone through years of white flight and disinvestment, which led to a fiscal crisis. And in response to the crisis, the locally democratically elected government was replaced by city managers appointed by the governor of Michigan, Rick Snyder. And all of the cities that had city managers appointed to replace their local governments were majority Black. So this is a case where the structural violence of white flight and disinvestment was supported by the symbolic violence that blamed these majority Black cities for their financial crisis, despite the fact that it was industrialization, state disinvestment, and white flight that precipitated the crisis. Then the city manager made the decision to save money by shifting Flint's water source from the Detroit water system to the Flint River, but they didn't pay for the anti-corrosive additives that would have reduced the amount of lead in the water, and that led to a spike in lead levels in Flint. And that was detected by Dr. Hannah Atisha, who did the study of lead levels in children's blood. So there were several outrageous elements to the crisis in Flint, including city employees getting access to bottled water before the residents were even alerted that there was a problem, and concerned parents being gaslighted by city officials who told them nothing was wrong when their children started suffering symptoms. And so it's clear that the fact that Flint is a low-income and majority Black city was perceived to be related to the slow and non-urgent response of the officials. And there have been criminal indictments, but most of the charges have been dropped. Okay, so since then, the population of Flint has decreased, which worsens the tax base and exacerbates the crisis, the structural predicament of the city. So that's the situation in Flint. And we see the same kinds of things going on in Jackson. So Jackson is the capital of Mississippi, and over the course of the last half of the 20th century, white flight led to it being a majority Black city. The wealthiest residents started leaving after desegregation in the 60s. It went from 60% white to 83% Black. The same story of a lower tax base, disinvestment, and infrastructure decline. And the city is great. It has like awesome arts and culture. It's the home of Jackson State University, which is a historically Black university, but it has faced racism from the government of Mississippi. And I would call this disinvestment by disregard. Like Dr. Mitchell pointed out, the bond issues for infrastructure in Jackson have not passed. That's because they have been tabled and never voted on for decades. Neoliberal logics say the city is at fault for its own problems. And the governor of Mississippi, Tate Reeves, has blamed the city for mismanagement. But I'm drawing on an AP article that reported that Reeves boasted about denying Jackson bond funds from the legislature to be proof of his fiscal responsibility when he was running for office. He said that even though he did vote to support all the bonds that came up for a vote, the ones that were for Jackson just simply never came up. They just tabled them. And that's how Jackson missed out on the millions of dollars it's been requesting for years to repair its water infrastructure. And then he turns around and blames the city for mismanaging its infrastructure at this, and takes credit for the state for coming to the city's rescue, and continues to refuse funds to actually repair the city's water systems. So in these cases, what we're seeing is something interesting, because it's these post-industrial economic conditions where these are urban areas that are suffering the effects of economic transformations away from manufacturing or local economic networks. It's structural violence that's caused by market forces that are supposedly neutral. And we see the symbolic violence of neoliberal logics that say, individual responsibility. They blame municipalities for the results of this economic disinvestment. And we see outright racism that ignores the public health effects of these water crises on children, especially on children. And so these aren't in cases of environmental racism that are related to, these aren't unrelated to the previous ones that are based on locally unwanted land uses and toxic waste disposals, but they are marked by an emergent post-industrial reality in the US that is neoliberalism leading to underdevelopment in parts of the US that have been abandoned by capital and the state. And so we have neglect and disinvestment as the driving forces behind environmental injustice. Thanks.
Oh, I'm happy to go. Yeah, so thank you so much for having me talk about this extremely topical issue. And so I'm going to frame my discussion around 4 main points. The first is that Jackson and Flint are not alone. I would say in general, water in the United States is quite good as a whole, but Jackson and Flint are representative of what is happening with water services throughout the country in Black, brown, and poor communities primarily, but not just those communities. And so I don't want to cast a shadow on drinking water in the US. I think in general, tap water is good, but we definitely have problems. The second thing I want to note is that state and local regulatory and political institutions are really ill-suited to respond to the current infrastructure crisis that the United States is facing, and potentially ill-suited to provide safe drinking water as currently constituted. And then third, the impact of these series of problems go beyond one city. When you have issues like Flint or Jackson, they impact trust everywhere and have important downstream effects on civic participation, consumer behavior, and trust in government. And the fourth thing is, I think there are things we can do to make things better. So it's not all doom and gloom, I don't think. So the first thing is in terms of just environmental justice, I'm not going to, repeat a lot of what has been said, but certainly Jackson is not alone. In 2015, my co-author Manny Teodoro and I were working on a paper on environmental justice and the Safe Drinking Water Act, and simultaneously keeping close tabs on the situation in Flint. And so we found that utilities serving Black and Hispanic communities and poor Black and Hispanic communities specifically were far likelier to have significant Safe Drinking Water Act violations than whiter and wealthier communities. And so as Flint is happening, and actually there are other issues, there are other cases in that time period that didn't get as much attention, but kind of bear a similar resemblance, right? I mean, Newark had a issue with lead pipes just after Flint. There's I believe Corpus Christi in Texas, slightly different set of situations. It's not one of these kind of post-industrial cities, majority Black cities, but a poor Hispanic community. And so, we're kind of looking at this at large and statistical rather than maybe these individual cases, but we're kind of identifying, that Flint is definitely not alone. And in fact, some of the most severe drinking water issues in the United States are not actually in poor Black and Hispanic communities, but actually on tribal land. And so Indigenous communities in the United States face some of the most difficult water circumstances in terms of both the Safe Drinking Water Act and Clean Water Act. And so, an even more marginalized community historically, well, I don't want to say even more, right? Another historically marginalized community experiencing drinking water and sewer issues as well. So the specific circumstances of Jackson, which are major flooding, the pounding years of infrastructure underinvestment, and Flint, the emergency manager law switched to the Flint River from the Detroit water system, those are unique in each circumstance, right? What leads to the water crisis in each circumstance is in each case, you can point to A, B, and C lettuce here. But again, there's systematic patterns that are observable throughout the United States. And again, it's poor Black and brown cities, often cities that have been afflicted by white flight and systematic racism that are most often facing drinking water issues. And so, the second thing I want to get to is kind of thinking about the institutions that kind of govern drinking water in the United States and why we maybe have some issues. And so as a political scientist by training, I often think about things in terms of institutions and incentives, and what institutions govern a specific area, and how that structures the incentives facing decision makers. And I think both our state level regulatory regimes and local political decision-making processes are incredibly ill-suited to good drinking water governance in many cases. So the regulatory regime, right? The Safe Drinking Water Act, like the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, RCRA, Superfund, has saved millions of lives, right? The existence of a federal regime, regulatory regime protecting drinking water is incredibly important. And there are things to love about the Safe Drinking Water Act. But it has a hard time dealing with cases like Jackson. Jackson has had 87 violations of the Safe Drinking Water Act since 1980. 78 of them have been since the year 2000. 43 of them are considered major violations of the Safe Drinking Water Act. 38 of them are health-based, and most of these being maximum contaminant limit violations, meaning contaminants regulated by the EPA for health reasons. Jackson's water exceeded on these counts. So we're talking about 38 times in the past 20, well, it's probably 33 times, I think, in the past 20 years, Jackson has had contaminants above EPA health limits in terms of maximum contaminant limits. Almost all of the actions taken by MDEQ in Mississippi have been informal actions and typically not formal enforcement actions against Jackson. Well, one of the reasons it is, I think you could say this is certainly there's elements of systemic racism here, but I also think state regulatory agencies are ill-equipped to deal with cases of underinvestment and repeated violation. I guess, one solution they have is the stick, right? You can fine the city of Jackson repeatedly for violating, but what you're doing is you're fining a city that already lacks resources due to due to white flight and a limited tax base, that is already having issues of underinvestment, right? And so where does that money go? It goes into the rates, right, which people have to pay, or comes out of something that would have gone into investment. And so it's very difficult, I think, for state regulatory regimes to deal with these types of cases. And additionally, local electoral institutions are really ill-suited to provide strong water services. Elected politicians emphasize things on short time horizons that make splashy impacts for voters. Good infrastructure management requires long-term planning horizons, and when it goes well, you don't hear about it. You don't hear about it, right? People don't call their city council member saying, hey, I turned my water on and water came out, right? That's not something that they typically emphasize. And so, they do complain about rates though, and that's what a lot of local politicians are often concerned with. And I think I agree, right? Like the state politics of the Jackson case are horrific in terms of neglecting the bonds and these types of things. But even the mayor has said we've neglected, right, our infrastructure for 30 years. And that is, in some ways, I don't think it's the people of Jackson that are to blame. I think it's electoral incentives say, okay, are we going to raise rates this year? And it's hard to raise rates on people who are struggling to pay their water bills, right? I think it's difficult, but I think we have this issue and we're facing it in Columbia right now. I hate to say it, but our city council has repeatedly over the past 4 years refused to raise water rates because of fear of voters. And because of that, now they have to raise them a lot more to pay for necessary infrastructure upgrades. They are going to pay for it, but it ultimately had to get paid for. And so neglecting, because of the short time, and this is state and local officials, because the short time horizons of their political decision making, Tate Reeves making short time horizon decision making, right, saying this is going to help me win election, not doing what's best for the people of Jackson or the people of Mississippi, right, but saying I'm going to win election on the basis of this, right? Is that necessarily, how we want decisions over critical infrastructure to be made? And so, the Jackson water crisis didn't happen overnight. Right? It took 30 years of infrastructure neglect from both state and local political officials, right? I don't know that decoupling politics from water decision making is the right approach. I actually have some disagreements with one of my main co-authors on this, but certainly providing better regulatory regimes and better oversight is a step in the right direction. The third point I want to make relatively quickly is that the impact goes beyond Jackson. And so unfortunately, like we were timely in 2015, we're timely once again. We just published a new book, and so I'm going to do some self-promotion. The Profits of Distrust, Citizen Consumers Drinking Water and the Crisis of Confidence in American Government. And so it's currently available from Cambridge Press. Go buy it. And so, we published this book in late August. It came out in late August. So, as Jackson is happening. And what we do in the book is link tap water failure to distrusting government. And so when people experience tap water failure, when they see tap water failure elsewhere, their trust in government goes down. And then when people distrust government, they choose consumer products over public services. Things like bottled water, things like water kiosks, which are increasingly common in the US Southwest, but are almost certain to move into other parts of the United States as well. So these are places where you go and you fill up your water bottles at this kiosk. And it's really just tap water that's going through reverse osmosis systems, but being upcharged by hundreds, right? You're paying way more water for a less regulated product that you're paying a premium for, right? And so people are turning away from publicly provided services because of distrust in government and towards these consumer products, right? Provided by private corporations. Additionally, and then people who choose tap water, who choose kiosks, end up actually participating less in political processes, and specifically political processes around drinking water, right? If you have decided the government can't provide you services of a certain quality, and so you're going to turn to private companies, what incentive do you have to continue to participate, to have civic levels of civic engagement? And so we connect that as well. But one of the big things that we found is this idea of hyperopia, which is that failure in one place leads to distrust everywhere, right? And so, you see something like Flint happen, you see something like Jackson happen, it makes you trust your own water prices, right? It makes you more likely to drink bottled water. It makes you more likely to turn to a kiosk. And so, just generally, historically, politically marginalized groups, Black Americans, Hispanics in the Southwest, people in Appalachia are most likely to use bottled water, most likely to use kiosks. And then, once again, that consumption is associated with lower levels of political participation. And so, Jackson is this one confluence of events, right? That one city's decision, one state's decision to neglect infrastructure investment, a series of systematic racism and white flight. This is something you see over and over again with cities, is cities that have, and it's related to the pipes, right? You built a pipe, you built a system for 200,000 people, and now you have 100,000 people, right? And so you still need to maintain the system for 200,000 people, but you only have 100,000 ratepayers, right? This is just from a pure like infrastructure to person ratio is a problem. And so you see that again and again. But again, like these have big nationwide effects, even singular events in a city. And so kind of making those connections important. And so I'm not going to take too much more time. What I'll say is, in the book, we do come up with some what we view as solutions that involve making water excellent, open, important to be transparent. And then the crucial thing I think for Jackson and Flint is equity, right? Not ignoring environmental justice, putting it at the forefront of regulatory decision-making, of public utility commission decision-making, et cetera. So that's what I've got.
Thank you. Thank you. I would definitely like to start by acknowledging both panelists and thanking them for making the time that I have to speak much shorter. So I'll keep this shorter. Particular. I'll make just 3 points as a way to sum of what we were talking about, and try not to be too doom and gloom. Thinking of the first point in particular, thinking of my panelists that just spoke, America has a problem. In particular, when we think about water, we don't think about the fact that America does not, as a global kind of system, does not have clean water for everyone. And so when we think about that, we see the Flints, we see Jackson, Mississippi, we see, for example, the indigenous communities that have been disenfranchised for decades. But then, for example, you scroll on your phone and you see something happening in Chicago. Black and brown, particularly Hispanic populations, have higher rates of lead in their water. And it's concentrated in certain areas. Or, for example, when I'm talking to my students about just the lack of clean drinking water and how common it is, we talk about communities in Appalachia and most likely, or communities in West Virginia. And so they're a little confused. Well, why are we talking about this? These are poor white communities who are also suffering at the same rate. And so when I think about particularly highlighting and honing in on Jackson, Mississippi, and making sure that they are at the forefront of this entire discussion, I think about the fact that as a system, America is dying of our complicity in whiteness. And so what that is meaning is our complicity in these systems that if you don't have it, too bad. I can get clean water. I can move my entire family. Or one of the ways in which we think about it from a public health standpoint, which I try to really educate my students about, is, well, why don't these communities vote? These communities should just, go up to their councilmen and protest. And while I think that is a very viable reason, we need to think about agency and how agency is given or taken away from certain communities, and how that leads to this perpetuation of whiteness, which spreads in the system that says, if you don't have it, you aren't working hard enough. And if you aren't working hard enough, it's not the government's responsibility to help you. And so I think about that. And so when thinking about dying of whiteness, or just our complicity as a whole in whiteness, I think about the simple social determinants of health. So the social determinants of health are the environments in which we grow, we live, we learn, we just prosper. And so when we think about the social determinants and couch it within the system of whiteness, we can see the ways in which we are perpetually maintaining and disenfranchising subjugated groups. And in order for this country to run, we need certain groups to continue to be subjugated. So what way can we do it? The simple way. taking away your drinking water. Okay, well, we'll supply you with bottled water. And of course, not to go too far down the rabbit hole, but there have been lots of discussions and actual empirical data illustrating the amount of microplastics we have in our body. And for example, they did a study that found microplastics in breast milk. And so we think about future generations, or we think about something as simple as lead, and we think about education. And so, for example, kind of going past the whole discussions we have about critical race theory in schools, we can think about something as simple as behavior. We have these connotations of certain demographics having poor behavior. They don't want to learn. They're not invested in school. But if we actually do a simple Google search or just learn more about what's going on, we see that actual empirical studies have linked these higher rates of lead to poor behavioral problems. And so once again, what I want to do is focus on our complicity and whiteness, focus on social determinants of health, and lastly, focus on, which both panelists perfectly sum up, our need for racialized capitalism as a way to really illustrate the need for us to move victim blaming and really understand the ways in which all of us are complicit in these systems that tell others, if you don't have it, then too bad. I will definitely spend my time reading something on a news page or watching the news, but how do we really understand and give humanity to these communities? So for example, thinking about racial capitalism, we need, again, that subjugated growth. How do we get it? We're charging you for your water. Can't pay it? How can I help you? So for example, thinking about Flint and the actual water bills and the amounts that these communities had to pay for something that was out of their reach, for something that was not structurally their fault, but are still expected to pay. So we can think about the ways in which these kind of global systems work in a way to perpetuate the have and the have-nots, and how that perpetuation of the have and the have-nots leads to a lot of these poor health outcomes from a public health standpoint that maintains these systems and keeps them just the way we want them to be.
Thanks. This has been great. We're going to open up for conversation. Certainly those online. I think I have to sort of get back here to be in camera view, my end view.
Yes.
All right. Both our audience here and online, and our Zoom folks. I'm going to start with some of the conversations. I'm going to take my moderator privilege, of course, and ask my first question. That's it. If you do. When you think about the infrastructure issue, either casting them, putting the narrative of environmental racism, the issues of long-term health issues, the disinvestment that occurs, we view this as a contemporary issue now, right? But it's clearly on a continuum of things that happened in the past, and it's going to have an impact on things that are going forward. So what's the intervention, right? What's the intervention that is needed now to basically forestall what occurred and, quite frankly, change the potential outcome, right? You talked about, education and individuals' behavior. How do you get rid of, how do you stop the environmental racism in this context? Because you're talking about people who are poor and often powerless, right? And so what is the intervention that actually does that? And then I would ask that, I would sort of the additional piece to David is really the federal government going to actually be able to do it, given what I would say is, for all, the increased balkanization of our political structure right now? So, I'll cast anyone of you to step up.
So, I mean, I'll start with kind of the last point, which is the federal government and money. I mean, one thing we can say is, the bipartisan infrastructure bill includes a significant investment in drinking water, and specifically the involves distribution to the state revolving funds with advice to distribute it to disadvantaged communities. Now, the issue there is they don't define what that means, and states, as the ones in charge of the money, can define that how they want, right? And that's the concern. That said, I think one thing we kind of emphasize in the book is that just like money alone is not a problem, right? Like I think throughout my talk, I'm talking about institutions and incentives, right? And so if we just kind of toss a bunch of money in short-term fixes, which we did in the 1970s when we created the systems originally, right, with the major investment from the Safe Drinking Water Act, right? What we did then is we created systems that would start to fail in about 40 years, and set up, kind of a situation in which the incentives at that point would all of a sudden we go, oh shit, our infrastructure aged, what now? And my concern is if we just throw a bunch of money at it in 2022, all of a sudden in 2050, we're going to be having the same problem, except we didn't throw nearly as much money in 2022. And so, I think we have our own ideas about how to fix the incentive structures, how to think about the institutions. And I know my fellow panelists have probably different perspectives. But I think now is the time to start thinking about different ideas for structuring water governance in the United States, because clearly the way we've done it over the past 50 years has failed. It is not working. And so, yeah, that would be my general comment.
Yeah, I think I would say that even if it's not a really good investment, we still need to make it, in the short term for like the next 40 years. And I think that the Inflation Reduction Act was kind of a hobbled version of what we really needed. Like things that people have been talking about, like the Green New Deal, and like a reinvestment in infrastructure, and a reinvestment in infrastructure that has more of a holistic kind of moving sustainability focus. That's like a pipe dream, but that's what I think. But I think your point about the way that the incentive structure and the regulatory structure is well taken. It's like, but that's part of like maybe reorienting it around a more sustainable model. But like I said, I think that's kind of a pipe dream.
Definitely continue on the transition of pipe dreams. Thinking of 2 points. So just for fun, I started reading Bell Hooks All About Love. And throughout the entire book, she talks about love. And one of the things I really enjoyed was the move past romantic love. And so one of the things that I have seen and also learned kind of during my time in academia, just learning more about public health, it's not necessarily so much that we don't love one another, we don't see the humanity in one another. We are unable to, or systemically unable to see that humanity, particularly when these groups that are suffering have been disenfranchised for centuries or decades. It's very hard for us to kind of rewire our brains to see and to understand the ways in which our complicities in these systems are leading to this disenfranchisement. And I'm thinking that's because of just rugged individualism and the ways in which this country was built. And so thinking of one of my students, our forefathers pulled themselves up and created X, Y, and Z. Why can't these communities do that? And so thinking again about that agency, just thinking again about that love or that lack of humanity that we do not give systematically to Black and brown people, because we just don't see them as. And so how does that manifest? In years of living without clean water. And another kind of pipe dream would be to kind of end or dismantle structural racism, but that's another panel we spend days talking about. But that's one of the ways in which understanding racism for what it is, it's not someone said something negative to me, or they just have these ideas, erroneous ideas about my community. It's the laws, it's the policies, it's the rule books, it's the ideologies that guide everything that say, if Indigenous communities don't have water, then they should fix it on their own. Or if Black and brown communities can't pay for their water, they should get a job. And so how do we really understand these systems that, if we're being honest, we were all socialized to believe and have had to hopefully take some time to kind of disenfranchise ourselves from, keep these communities where they are, and how that area or how that ways in which we kind of maintain that subjugation just keeps us where we're at.
Go through the questions you folks here do. So please tell us who you are. Yeah, first.
I'm Jack Meisenbach. I live out at Old Hawthorne. I've moved to Columbia from Lake St. Louis, where I worked for McDonnell Douglas and Boeing for 44 years. I would ask, how many of you have ever gone to a Missouri Clean Air Commission meeting in Jeff City, or a clean water commission meeting in Jeff City. If you have never done that, that's where you need to start. Those people are supposed to take care of our air and our water, which is a basic need for everybody, no matter what color you are, okay? They're not doing that. The Clean Air Commission, for one, what they do is they perform a clerical function only. You see what I'm saying? A concentrated animal feeding operation comes in and says, we want to put in this facility, have 6,000 hogs, and they're going to make sure you dotted all the I's and crossed all the T's. They are not concerned with any operational risk of the location, the soil makeup, topography, risk to the thing, the ponds leaking into the aquifer. They don't care about that. And I attended meetings where engineers gave them Missouri DNR data to show them that this is not a good place to do this. You're asking for trouble. They ignored it and they voted for it. And the chair came out and says, that's not our job. We don't care about operational risk. All we care about is making sure we have permits. And the Water Commission is better, but they're reactionary too. They're not in the front of this thing. They are looking at 700 or 800 impaired waters in the state of Missouri. Okay, the Mississippi just got labeled a number. What is it? Second or maybe it's the fifth most polluted river in the whole country. Okay, this stuff, it's not being managed like you think it is. It's very, very disturbing.
So I think that illuminates here's one about institutions. It's the wrong institutions that are actually governing or having this opportunity to actually try to manage this, right? We've got some questions from Susan.
Yes.
So Kate's gonna pose those, or at least pose one.
Okay. I have a few. Is Dr. Switzler proposing moving the venue of policy change for water quality regulation from the city level to the federal level?
Well, so regulation is complicated because it's mostly done at the state level in the United States for drinking water. Other than Wyoming and the District of Columbia, and then a few of the Indian reservations, it's the states that have regulatory authority. And certainly there's been lots of Office of Inspector General reports on basically the issues of EPA oversight of state regulation. I'm not necessarily saying that the state isn't the appropriate level. I mean, I think states are kind of a poor geographic unit generally for management, right? You've got, I mean, how can you really compare Rhode Island and Wyoming as regulatory units, right? It doesn't really make sense. So, I mean, I guess like in an ideal world, we would probably change that. I do think the federal government taking a more active role in terms of oversight of state regulatory regimes. One of the problems in Flint, I mean, there are 1,000, but one of the issues was Region 5 did not conduct proper oversight of the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality. And so, I think, I don't know that moving is the right term. I think changing the resources. I mean, I think for one, combining public utility commissions work with regulatory quality work and actually providing more oversight over rates from the state level, that I would say, because what you have right now, and I can tell you in the city of Columbia, we have local politicians who don't know anything about drinking water, making decisions about drinking water for a city of 130,000 people. And they're ignoring the advice of their staff. And so sometimes you need sometimes you need experts at a state level to come in and say, you shouldn't do this. The state of Wisconsin regulates all of its municipal utilities at the state level. They regulate the water rates. It's the only state in the country that does that. And I just got a text from one of my co-authors today who looked over one of the reports from the PUC. He said, I've never seen a city have to go into this much detail about its water rates. So yeah, I kind of am saying, I'm not necessarily saying federalize rate making, but I do think having oversight over rate making, and specifically not just, I mean, a lot of what current public utility commissions do is make sure private companies don't charge too much. I actually think public utility commissions should make sure municipal utilities charge enough. And water's complicated. And if in an ideal world, it would not operate exclusively as an enterprise service where you pay for the water you get. For pools and landscape irrigation, it absolutely would operate that way, right? You're going to put stress on the system. We're gonna make you pay. It's a public good and a human right. Like in an ideal world, this isn't something that you pay for drinking water, right? We don't live in that world. And so at the moment, right, like the current issue is underinvestment. And so figuring out ways to harmonize regulatory regimes and funding in a way that aligns incentives properly instead of what we currently have, I think is what my recommendation would be generally.
Thank you. I have another one.
Any questions here? Any other questions here? Questions here? Another one.
Okay. Federalization of this issue would implicate the other water crisis evident in the Western states. Is there an intersection here that would amplify the need for a different governance regime? I think you just answered. There's another question from the same person. To what degree does the way we consume media now affect the way people understand and respond to things like this water crisis? Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say 1967, the Cuyahoga River catches on fire for the third time in however many years, and we get the Clean Water Act. We have Flint, which has been in the news off and on, and then Jackson, which is in the news. Actually, it's funny, people talk about the Jackson water crisis in 2022. I remember the news stories in 2021, right? When they barely hit the national news. But we don't get change because it's like, it's out of mind like that, right? And so I think it definitely, the short attention span, the 24-hour media cycle, right? I think that all kind of makes it harder to respond to crises that are kind of characterized by these kind of recurrent things, right? Versus the economy is always there, but like, these drinking water crises are,
There might be a little more of a there might be a little more of a echo chamber effect where people are not there's not like a nightly news where it's like the Cuyahoga River is on fire. It's like people are in their own lanes looking at media separately and listening to all kinds of different media that tell them different things, and that doesn't lead to a kind of a cohesive social movement towards any kind of actual policy.
Well, I'm gonna go ahead.
100% agree. And you have to think about that 24-hour media cycle, but also how are we getting scrolling?
Yeah.
Constantly scrolling. Okay, they don't have clean. Oh, yeah. Okay. So a part of the United States is on fire. Okay, well, we're about to vote on this. And so how do we learn how to not only decipher what is being told to us, how to understand the ways in which sometimes this information is sensationalized? For example, sometimes reading the articles, they might be 2 or 3 paragraphs. This area is facing this. For example, I think it was in Las Vegas that they were having an issue about to run out of water. And that's all it said. It's like, okay, well, what's actually going on? Again, thinking about your point, the disenfranchisement in those certain areas, and thinking about Las Vegas running out of water of all places in the United States. That's where we go to have our fun.
Mm-hmm.
And so really digging deeper. And of course, not taking off my hat of elitism and really understanding, like, if you do read these things, it's not your responsibility to go on Google, spend 2 hours researching, because not everyone has time for that. But how do we kind of sometimes push back against the media and really hold them more accountable for the ways in which they are deciphering or presenting this information?
Yeah. So I want to follow up on a couple of the things that you said. So it's interesting, right? So when we talk about Jackson, Mississippi, the issue of environmental racism and history of race is clearly front and center. We're talking about Mississippi with a strong history, anti-civil rights, basically anti-blackness, right? But like Michigan's not the Deep South, right? Water crisis in Nevada, that's not the Deep South, right? And you've got this water issue that permeates a variety of different communities, and yet are they facing an environmental Is it environmental inequity with respect to Nevada? Is it environmental racism in Michigan based upon a history of redlining and white flight? Are we talking, is it environmental racism that's embedded in a larger issue of sort of a lack of the human rights issue with respect to the three different areas? Because they're very different in terms of their historical underpinnings, right?
I mean, I think what we're seeing is like that's why the term sacrifice zone is useful, because it shows the way that the negative effects of industrialization and what we call overdevelopment and overconsumption are concentrated on the most marginalized and powerless people. And that's why we see environmental racism. But and that's, you know, that's where we see that the residential segregation is critical to the existence of certain industries, because there has to be somewhere to put the waste. You can't keep the waste. You just have to have somewhere to put the waste. So there's got to be a sacrifice zone of some community that's targeted to be disposable. Having said that, the effects don't stay in those places, and it's like it becomes it's a general condition. And I think one of the things we're seeing with these increasing crises, like fires in the West and running out of water in Las Vegas, is the fact that that's why I use the term underdevelopment, because the US is like, it's the infrastructure and the systems are being undermined and are struggling to maintain safe spaces for even the privileged. You know, the privileged are still okay, but it's, you know, debatable. So that's what I think. So I mean, I think that traditionally only the most marginalized communities have suffered, but it's not necessarily it's not limited to them.
Definitely want to wholeheartedly agree with everything you said. And also thank you, David, for that question, because it's a really good point. And one of the things I tried to illustrate, even particularly my women's and gender studies, when we're thinking about racism, we all this idea it's just in the South. And if that's someone who grew up in the South and is now living in the Midwest, same here. It's just different. And so when we are talking about Chicago, when we are talking about Las Vegas, when we are talking about Flint, Michigan, where we're talking about Mississippi, we're talking about these same systems. And so I just want to reiterate, same thing I tell my students: if you take nothing from any of the courses I teach, understand that our investment in racism is slowly but surely killing us all, regardless of where you identify on that racial or ethnic kind of how you identify racially or ethnically. It is slowly taking away, for example, our years of life lived. It's slowly killing our education system. It's slowly killing these just systems that, or just basic social determinants of health. And so regardless of where it's at, these systems are all the same, and it's all deadly.
So I've got two comments. A great question. One thing is, actually, I think that the water crisis in the West is not related to, at least, not always environmental racism, but at least the kind of citing of things in zones of traditionally marginalized groups. So when you think about like where dams went and what communities would have to be flooded for the development of the West, they traditionally, often they would move the planned dam to protect a rich community over a poor community, right? Or often indigenous communities are the ones who were hurt from this. And so it's actually not unrelated to kind of like just the development of infrastructure throughout the US, not just like drinking water infrastructure, but water infrastructure as dams and the rest. The other thing I'll say is I think this idea of like residential segregation is so interesting because obviously, but like what I mean is one of the cities that you would think would have similar issues to Flint and Detroit and Jackson is Cleveland, right? Once a city of 800,000 people, majority white, now a city of 350,000 people, majority black, but they don't have drinking water issues to the same extent, right? They have lead pipes, but they're replacing them, and they have a well-funded utility that does a lot of good things, that has all types of interesting programs. And how do they accomplish this? Well, the city of Cleveland's water utility serves all the suburbs. And so it has something of a shared fate between the people who had flight from the community and the Black people who remain within the center city. And so kind of overcoming residential segregation by expanding the kind of governance limits and actually the very limits of infrastructure, right? We're all kind of getting water from the same treatment plant, even though you moved out of this neighborhood 30 years ago, right? We still have that same shared element. And actually, I mean, it's actually justified on a cost of service basis, but actually the suburbs pay more for their water because it costs more to pump water out there. But that's how the city of Cleveland has been able to maintain its kind of high level of water quality. And actually the sewer system, which developed out of Cleveland, obviously the Cuyahoga River catching on fire, and some of the worst sewer issues in history. And they actually created a special district that encompassed the city of Cleveland, but also the suburbs. And so I think connecting kind of people through infrastructure, I think is, like you can't ignore the infrastructure for, your Black neighbors if it's your same infrastructure, right? And so kind of connection through the actual extension of pipes. And that's been one of the things that it's controversial in Jackson. So I don't want to say it is the solution, because it's tough to say, hey, now you have to go share your water with the surrounding areas and both people, there's a lot of built up history of distrust there. So, I can't sit here and say Cleveland has an entirely different historical kind of thing that happened with its utility. And so saying, let's just transplant that to Jackson doesn't work. But I do think it's an interesting case of a city that has kind of escaped these issues through, honestly, like the connection of infrastructure.
Of course, questions?
I agree with David that the states should be the ones to manage the waters and the air systems for them, because they have unique operations, unique topography, and so forth. But somebody mentioned the federal government, and I want to tell you, they have got big problems. Hawaii, where the fuel is leaking into the water system from a ship refueling facility, and then there's a military base that's been on television. If you were at this base for so many years, you may be, switching chemicals. Yeah. But here's the other one that you got to really think about is the climate change is going to outpace the racism issue for us. It's going to kill us. If you look at the military bases, almost all of them are along the seacoast. Norfolk, Virginia is going to be the first one that's going to be underwater. The boats will float, but you won't be able to get there. The docks are going to be underwater. And once the sea level comes in, you have that surge. It takes out the water systems, electrical systems, everything in the community around there. That's a big worry. And there's because we are continually warming up and we're continually making the air dirtier and dirtier and dirtier, we are reaching what they call a tipping point. And there's 16 tipping points that Greta Thunberg or somebody identified. Okay, we've already hit 5 of them. Okay, 5 of them out of the 16. So Mother Nature is going to start taking over, and we're going to get more violent storms, more glaciers melting, more Antarctic ice melting, sea level rise, and all this stuff.
But then that's interesting. So I think in the aftermath of the recent hurricane, folks were talking about issues about where folks were living, who's hit hardest in terms of poor communities, who was going to have less access to insurance to rebuild. But if you think about the Jackson case, you had the flooding. These storms just created the flooding, which overwhelmed the infrastructure, right? And so clearly there's a direct connection. And so speak on that a little bit, if you know.
So the first thing I'll say is I disagree that climate change is going to outpace the racism issue.
You think?
Climate change is an issue of environmental justice, fundamentally.
Oh.
It is exactly what you're saying, right? Who is going to be impacted by climate change? It's the communities who can't move, right? Who because of structural racism, because of redlining, right, back to the historical nature of property values, right, and accumulated wealth, climate change is an environmental racism issue, like at its core in terms of its impact, right? Like wealthy people and wealthy and white people are not going to be the ones impacted by climate change. And already Americans in Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands are even more so than Florida, right? The ones who are being impacted, and those are Black and brown communities. And they're just the first ones, and we tend to forget them because they don't have political representation. But those are not two things. They are fundamentally one.
Okay, I want to subscribe, or that is, any questions about Zoom?
Sorry.
No, you're right. Yeah, I agree.
Is regionalism a better solution than federalizing the issue?
Yes and no. Depends. Depends on the circumstances. I mean, I think like
Yes.
there are, the federal government has a role to play and regions have a role to play and states have a role to play. And I think figuring out the proper roles is right, but I mean, there are certain systems that probably need to be regionalized and certain that need to be federalized. And so I think as a general rule, yes and no, there's no general rule.
So I'll ask another call from this, and this is, so, is when folks think about water issues, they think about developing third world nations, developing nations, right? They don't think about the United States, right? And you all mentioned that this is a systemic US problem in what is deemed to be a first world nation, right? And so question is then, how do you get that narrative across to people that this is not an other problem? This is a embedded US problem that needs to be addressed. And the follow-up I would ask is, I would say is that is, when folks think infrastructure, they think visible infrastructure, bridges, roads, what have you. They don't think invisible infrastructure, sewer pipes, water, right? That's the thing that's behind the walls, that unless it's not working, then I have a problem. If it's working, like you said, I have no problem with it. And so how do you remove that from this invisibility without having to have groundwater first and a boiling advisory so people actually give a damn about it, right?
I have a comment, but I want to see it. I mean, has anybody looked at a CCR, a consumer confidence report from their water utility ever?
Yeah, look at it.
Is it readable? It's unreadable. It's horrible. This
I
is
have a
the
master's degree in business.
Sure.
But you know,
so 1996, people, the EPA realized something's wrong with drinking water in the United States. Let's amend the Safe Drinking Water Act. One of the things they wanted to do was, first it was the lead copper rule, but the other thing was we want to improve public communication. So they required the publication of these consumer confidence reports that are unintelligible. Shri Vedachalam from EPIC, it's a nonprofit environmental policy something. I can't remember off the top of my head. Has did an analysis of this, and it's like you need to basically have a bachelor's degree in chemistry to be able to understand this. This isn't solving the public communication problem, and so I think figuring out ways to make people realize, hey, our water system's failing. Why isn't the city council doing something about it other than sending them a report that says, hey, we had 2 violations this year? What is the violation? Oh, we had 0.05 parts per billion instead of 0.04 parts per billion, right? Like that's not communication. And so one thing we actually proposed in the book, and it's not our original idea, is the use of report cards, right? Like that are based on standards of regulation. You say, okay, are you investing enough to cover your bond rating? What's your water quality like? Right, all these things, and you submit a report card every year, and that gets set. And interested citizens like Jack can look deeper if they want. But for the everyday citizen, they say, oh, the state is saying we are not doing well on investment. We're not doing well on quality, right? And so making it visible. Will everybody read that? No, but tweet it, Facebook it, shoot, do a TikTok. I don't know. But figuring out ways to actually make the invisible visible. Civic architecture was something that was done when these water systems were first built. It was like, we're going to have a fountain that's showing our water system, in the water that's producing. We're going to have, bubblers out in the city. We're going to show off this amazing new infrastructure. So civic architecture, I think, is another way of making it visible. So.
I think for me, one of the things I've learned while being an academic is I definitely have a passion for teaching. And it's more so a passion for teaching because it illustrates to me and pushes me every day to learn how to simply communicate. And one of the things that I've learned throughout my time teaching at Mizzou and also teaching as a doctoral student is that regardless of, or conversations with family members, for them to understand something's happening, you have to kind of put it in their wheelhouse. And so one of the things I remember my first year teaching, I was like, yeah, we're going to talk about the fact that America doesn't have water. We're going to talk about the social determinants of health, and everyone is going to be gung-ho and excited. And one of the things I had to learn was, number one, they didn't know what these terms meant. But number two, what does that have to do with me? And so when I think about water, the fact that we don't think of America as having a problem with water, it depends on who you are illustrating having that. And so just thinking about how I have to connect with my students. Well, of course, we know that Black and brown people are more likely to be in areas that are environmentally unsafe. So we call this environmental racism. So it's a propensity for Black and brown people to be disproportionately situated in these areas because of structural and federal rules and regulations. However, did you know that, for example, poor white people are facing these problems? And I see light bulbs go on. And so I have to kind of explain once again, regardless of who the face is, our entrenchment in these systems of oppression is harming the health of all. And so that's one of the ways in which I had to illustrate that by making it applicable to them.
Any questions from Zoom? Oh, we have one here.
Talking about communication and how we kind of through on these issues and sort of short attention span and things like that. I'm wondering if you think that sort of crisis is like one of the requirements for major change to happen. Like I used to live in Southern California, and there was always, various times talk about conserving water and things like that. I remember somebody once said to me, the best thing would be if we all used a bunch of water to push us into crisis so we could stop fooling ourselves into thinking that things are okay. So I'm just wondering what you think the role of these kind of big events are in terms of pushing change forward, or if there's a way to not have to go get to that point to make change.
So I can talk about it from a policy process perspective, which is what I teach. And so I mean, I think, yes, often it is the case. So like, I tend to be a proponent of John Kingdon. He's a scholar who talks about multiple streams need to be present for major policy change to happen. I tend to kind of buy it, which is the political winds need to be blowing the right way. Solutions need to be ready and agreed upon. And then there needs to be an identifiable problem. And typically that is revealed, at least in cases like water, through focusing events like Flint, like Jackson, like the Cuyahoga River catching on fire. And so my general perspective is just based on kind of my vision of how the policy process works. It's yes. Typically that's kind of how I view it, but there's lots of disagreement about that. It's not the only perspective.
And I think for me, understanding that I come from a place of privilege, for me to hear crisis, I immediately go into alarm, because just as the researcher and educator in me, well, what more can I learn? Or how can we kind of really, again, thinking of COVID, critique these systems of public health to really include or to be cognizant of how they are producing harm? But if I think of, for example, people in my family members, some of my family members, every day is a crisis for me. It's nothing new. So how do I continue to work a 9 to 5, continue to pay my bills, continue to support my family? And so once again, it's less of the onus being kind of put on individuals to kind of understand or even cut or subtract what they're doing, and understanding that it's an infrastructure problem. It's a system problem. It's embedded in everything we do. And so how do we understand it from that endpoint?
So I'm going to go with that. Being the law professor that I am, I'm going to throw out the legal aspect, right? Talked about potential future health and education crises stemming from the water issues. Talked about the past cases of environmental racism. Is there a mass tort case that is embedded in here that can actually be successful? Flint died on the vine because the charge of drought. But is there something when there is a deprivation of water in these instances that in effect citizens can sue on the basis of this is a mass tort? This is no different than a toxic spill in the environment, right? That the lack of water in this context creates this. Is there something more there based upon potential future harm or risk or existing risk, and it's leading to future harm?
I forget what's the lawsuit. I think they're trying to do a lawsuit against the state of Mississippi for Jackson. I don't remember what it is, but I remember, as you mentioned earlier, the burden is really hard.
It's against and the state.
Okay.
The NAACP, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's against both.
Oh, it is.
I mean, in my view, kind of unfortunately, because the city was so underfunded. But I mean, I've heard of cases of being, I don't know where they've gone because I haven't followed them extensively, but young people suing on the behalf of, you know, the future effects of climate change. Yeah, I don't know much about that.
I mean, I'll say from my perspective, like the Flint case kind of shows that the legal system is not super well equipped either necessarily to handle. I mean, the fact that we have basically the biggest known water crisis in you know modern times and not a single person has been convicted,
Yeah,
like that to me is quite concerning. Now, from a civil perspective, I don't know. I mean, the burdens are perhaps less to do that. And I don't know the law well enough to know. I mean, so I was at an event with a number of the NAACP LDF folks and talk about this, and I think they have the legal. So I was thinking about the institutions, right? The policy, and their kind of whole thing was like, how can we use the current existing legal structures to do that? And so I can't. They said a lot of things that I mostly understood, but can't say that I can relay here. I don't know it well enough, but I think it's they seem to have a lot of thought about how to use current legal understandings to pursue action.
There has been suits against these CAFO applications by the residents and their legal staff and that, and they've been successful in a few cases. The case you're talking about, it went to the Supreme Court several years ago, actually. I have not heard if it was ever adjudicated or
probably can
not.
take it up.
They may not have picked it up.
Yeah, Derek.
You mentioned regional solutions. Where that applies is like a watershed or the Missouri River system or the Mississippi River system. They have regional groups that are working those problems because they got a lot of problems besides flooding and all the affluent that's going in these things in the dead zone down by New Orleans and the Gulf of Mexico from all the stuff that's going down there. So that's going on. The other thing about Las Vegas running out of water, I want to tell you, I was at a Missouri River reclamation. I didn't know this, but there are 3 diversions that they're looking at to divert water to different places. One is the Red River in North Dakota. One is into the Kansas Ogallala aquifer that's getting low. They have like 4,000 CAFOs in there. And the third one is from Kansas City to run a diversion all the way to Denver to give them another source of water that they would also share with Phoenix and Las Vegas. But that's going to cost so much money. They have not started on that yet, but at least somebody has an idea about it because those cities will run out of water eventually unless we get rain. You know,
So how do you change the conversation around? So I'm thinking about, if I'm African American, I'm thinking about Black Lives Matter, I'm thinking about daily existence. If I'm thinking about other more pressing issues, again, more pressing because water is vital, but I'm thinking about things that are far more prescient in my existence on a daily basis, right? That in effect, to get to care about water, this public service, this public good, that I expect to be there, right? There's an expectation that you turn on the tap and you're going to get clean water, right? I mean, that's the expectation. There's going to be no sort of change about that. And so I can put my emphasis elsewhere. And now I have to sort of redirect that. Getting those individuals basically to sort of change the order of, if you will, importance of issues, all right, to sort of to redo that. Is it possible, in effect, given the wealth of things that are coming at you, right? I mean, and I said earlier, you know, right, this is on the back burner now. We got the war in Ukraine, things are ramping up, potential nuclear Armageddon, right? I mean, there are things when you've got those conversations, you're like, oh, well, water, you know, or the hurricane just hit so much, right? And so the issue is, I mean, this is an ongoing issue. And so how do you maintain ongoing issues when you've got immediate emergencies that sort of eclipse, right?
I don't know.
I mean, I think taking advantage when you have the opportunity, and I think a lot of people in the water industry are happy with the things in Build Back Better and Inflation Reduction Act. I mean, I think it's way less than was needed. And that's, who knows when there's going to be an opportunity where there's actual attention that I think was crystallized from the Flint water crisis
Right.
with and I mean, shoot, we're not in the situation anymore where the Clean Air Act was signed by Richard Nixon. The Clean Air Act amendments were signed by George H.W. Bush. There is polarization even on vital infrastructure like drinking water. And so I don't know when we're going to have a situation where there's going to be a Democratic majority. And to be frank, that's probably what's necessary, is a Democratic majority in the House and the Senate, a Democratic president. And it happens once every 10 years, and water isn't typically the front of the mind. And so I have a hard time imagining it being something that, like the economy, right, is always on the public's imagination. So when you have an opportunity, making the most of it. But I don't know that we did.
Well, I find it interesting. I can't imagine a candidate getting on a water platform when they're running on the campaign trail, like good clean water. That's what we need.
It'll happen.
You should.
And it probably should happen
Consider
sooner.
that clean water.
Final comments that you guys would like to offer on this issue, on where we move from here, on the impact, the health impact that might exist, the policy implications, the continuing environmental racism issues, and whether or not, and how to address this in a real concrete way. Like I mentioned before, and so as part of it, I think we as scholars often don't do scholar activism, and I think we should. So I would encourage folks who are here and on Zoom to find a charity to give to in Jackson to help. I know the microplastics, but I would imagine folks would like to drink some clean water. And so to find a to help to address the issues in a real positive way. And so to go beyond just sort of engaging, right, with the topic, go beyond the dialogue, actually going to the doing, right? But sort of final comments would be fantastic.
Well, I think one thing that came up for me during the last part of this conversation was the way that the ideology, like I'm thinking of the structural causes and the symbolic things that sort of back them up. One of the things we've been sort of talking about is the way that these seem to be things that address, there's a way that we're focusing on them happening to quote unquote other people. And then there's this social distance between the more privileged people and the people who seem to be the ones who are affected. And I think that idea that this is only happening to other people makes people have this feeling that it's not something that they have to worry about, that they're safe. And that's a problem that is critical to address.
Definitely agree. And thinking with climate change and those type of disasters, and even though I chuckle because I have a father who lives in Florida, Tampa to be exact, and I'm like, well, climate is changing and Florida's about to be underwater in Missouri. But it makes me also afraid of what we will see in the future. And again, I think the hope that I do have is taking your charge for that scholar activism and understanding that there are, and unfortunately it's always kind of in the hands of youth, those doing that groundwork. And for example, thinking about your question of keeping this in the forefront, those are the people who are doing that. And so with that kind of double-edged sword of understanding the burden that they are taking on, also taking on your charge and seeing how I could help with them.
Yeah, I guess I'll just finish by saying, I don't know what can drive institutional change. I just know we really need it. I mean, just observing, I've been doing this probably 10 years now. And, I was taking it from a purely scholarly perspective. And now I'm involved I've mentioned a lot about the city of Columbia on the Water and Light Advisory Board, just seeing like the actual things happen in practice. It's been kind of an eye-opening experience. And so maybe actually going to a city council meeting and seeing what's happening and being more engaged. I think it's definitely been a valuable thing for me that has helped me understand kind of some of the circumstances that can lead to this. And I mean, like one of the things, we talk about neoliberals. I mean, like one of the reasons we've had issues with water rates is because, people have supported the people who want to water their lawns and their swimming pools. And so because they were going to have to pay more, we shut down the entire rate increase. I don't know. It's just, so I don't know if that's a happy way to end. There are things we can do to make things better.
I could end on a high note. the
Well-
technology we have in this country can solve all these problems. And I'm gonna go to the council on your behalf, David, and ring their bell about it.
There you go.
But
So
this-
I want to thank folks. I want to thank our panel. Thank our panel for their presentation. It's a really important topic, and I think it's very interesting. It's a topic that's racialized, it's a topic that's class-based. But I like Becky's last point. It's actually in all of us problem, right? This is not a place that we can just say it's their water problem, because fundamentally it's all of our water problem, and it's going to impact us in a variety of different ways. And so I want to thank you both who are those who are in the Zoom sphere, folks who are here. Look forward to our next, keep on the lookout for our next event, which is November 16th. Stolen children, stolen lands, looking at indigenous communities and the issues around the Native American boarding school crisis, that issue, and having some speakers talk about that issue as part of Indigenous Peoples Heritage Month, which is November, and having that as a part of the conversation. But I really want to thank you, because I think some of these conversations we don't get to have about these really sort of prescient and current and present issues, because as scholars we have the long haul, we have the long look, but having people comment on it now and sort of I get that putting it back into the, if you will, the consciousness is fantastic. So once again, I thank you very much.
Thank you.